Here with you all to celebrate Book Day and St. George, talking about Cervantes and Shakespeare in this house, Cervantes House in London. Cervantes and Shakespeare are the two Renaissance authors who succeeded in formulating a new vision of humanity and the world. Their works reflect the shift which took place in Europe between the 6th and the 7th centuries, from a theocentric to a fundamentally anthropocentric understanding of the universe. Both laid the foundations for the Romantic Revolution, which still influences the way we think today. In the Western world, to make sense of our self-understanding, we need to keep looking at ourselves in the mirror held up to us by Cervantes and Shakespeare, particularly in works such as Don Quixote or Hamlet or King Lear. Their capacity for reinterpretation is endless. In fact, we are that interpretation. His work can be compared to the painting of Velázquez or the philosophy of René Descartes, in the sense that they created or began to create the modern subject, the realm of subjectivity. Shakespeare and Cervantes were contemporaries who lived parallel lives. Cervantes was not aware of Shakespeare, but it is quite possible that Shakespeare did read the first part of Don Quixote, translated by Thomas Shelton and published in 1612. One of the Bard's last works, The History of Cardenio, written in collaboration with John Fletcher, and which is lost today, even though partially restored by Gary Taylor from a work of the 18th century, is based on an episode from the novel. It is just fascinating to imagine with what enthusiasm Shakespeare read Cervantes, thinking how he might bring some of the Algos stories to the stage. Cervantes and Shakespeare were the children of an era which was nearing its end. It is precisely that end which fired their imagination. Cervantes experienced and reflected in his novel the twilight of the Spanish Empire of King Philip II of Spain, and Shakespeare, in his turn, experienced and dramatized the splendor and decline of Elizabeth I and the House of Tudor. So what exactly do we know about the lives of these authors? Cervantes was the son of a physician's assistant, so we may say today the assistant of a surgeon. He did not go to university, neither did Shakespeare. They both had to learn by doing, guided only by their intuitive genius. Cervantes was, above else, a soldier of the Christian cause and a fervent defender of the Spanish Empire. As is well known, he took part in the Battle of Lepanto, where, as legend has it, he lost a hand. In fact, he only suffered paralysis in one arm after he was shot. During his seafaring adventures with the Spanish Navy, he was imprisoned in Algiers. It was when he ultimately returned to Spain that, while working as a tax collector, he started writing his first books, such as La Galatea. It would seem that in 1597, Cervantes embezzled money and was sent to prison for misappropriation of funds, where at the age of 50, he started to conceive and imagine Don Quixote. Cervantes' earlier writings were failures. He had aspired to be a poet, a playwright, and a master of the pastoral genre. Triumph finally came for Cervantes with the publication of Don Quixote, for which he invented a new genre, the novel. What do we mean by that when we speak about novel? It is a genre which, unlike poetry and drama, has no rules. Don Quixote is quite simply an extended exemplary novel. Cervantes had already written novellas, which had been published under the title Novelas Ejemplares, exemplary novels. And the idea of an old Spanish novel, an hidalgo from La Mancha, who loses touch with reality because of his avid reading of chivalric novels, was initially the plot for one of these novellas. However, its protagonist, Don Quixote and Sancho, started to take on a life of their own, simply begging for more, so to speak, slapstick comedy style adventures. Cervantes thereby fostered the emergence of the genre which was to become the cornerstone of modernity. Intriguingly, Joyce's Ulysses, the novel which completes the Western European literature cycle initiated by Cervantes, was also originally conceived as a short story for Dubliners, his first very book. It was only later that it was extended to become a novel. Thus, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus walk in the long shadows cast by Don Quixote and Sancho. Cervantes and Shakespeare are the sons of the era of the printing press, an invention which revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge and democratized access to the Bible. Today, we who have lived with the consequences of the printing revolution are now starting to discern the contours of the new world being ushered in by another great revolution, the digital era. In the same way that we are witnessing the emergence of virtual reality, so too Cervantes and Shakespeare were pioneers and primitives of their own era. In the second part of the novel, Don Quixote walks into a print shop in Barcelona and engages in conversation with its employees. While their typesetting is nothing other than the apocryphal Don Quixote published by Avellaneda, the very book which convinced Cervantes to transpose his character from Zaragoza to Barcelona. With the invention of printing, Europe found itself divided into great blocks. On the one hand, there were the countries of the Lutheran Reformation, where the German culture was predominant. On the other were the Catholic countries, of which Spain was the most influential. Protestant countries such as Germany and England based their modern culture on the translation of the Bible into their vernacular languages. Luther was inspired by Erasmus' critique of the Vulgate, the canonical Latin translation by St. Jerome, in making his own German version of the sacred text. William Tyndale, in turn, was inspired by Luther for the first translation of the Bible into modern English, which later led to the Bible of Geneva, a book which influenced Shakespeare's entire generation. This work of translation culminated, of course, in the King James Version of the Bible of 1611. The issue of the translation of the Bible is essential for understanding the new vision of the world which Shakespeare and Cervantes gave us. As mentioned earlier, Shakespeare is a product of the Elizabethan era. After the many ideological upheavals with the nation experienced during the first half of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I endorsed a break with Rome, which her father, Henry VIII, had promulgated in the so-called Act of Supremacy of 1534. As part of affirming this decision with Catholicism, Elizabeth I prohibited the staged representation of her sacred themes, thereby, in the promulgation of 1559, years before Shakespeare was born, thereby putting an end to an age-old theatrical tradition and fostering the emergence of a new dramatic representation of humankind. Cervantes, for his part, was writing in a country isolated by the Counter-Reformation and closely monitored by the Inquisition. The Spanish language does not have a Bible with an influence comparable to that of English and German versions. Spanish does have the so-called Biblia del Oso by Casiodoro de Reina, a Catholic who converted to Protestantism. However, this translation, published in Switzerland, was not circulated in Spain and only came to be read much later. For that reason, as noted already by Miguel de Unamuno, Don Quixote is the Spanish Bible, where Cervantes takes comedic flight from the strict observance of Catholicism. In England, however, the prohibition of a stage representation of sacred themes provoked a shift in the dramatic representation of tragedy through the figure of Jesus Christ to that of the common man. Why is there no concept of modern tragedy in Spain? Why? This is a key problem which persisted until the Baroque era and until the work of Calderón. In Spain, the issue of tragedy, which in essence is that of death, continued to be dominated by the figure of Jesus Christ, the God who became man so as to be able to share humankind's experience of death for the first time. Cervantes was in a way forced to invent a new genre to address this same issue, but chose to do it through the perspective of parody. Tragedy is a sacred genre, which belongs to liturgy and to the stage. There is always a ritual residual to all theatrical works. The novel, however, has lost any such connection with the sacred. The novel is somewhat of a bastard genre, anarchic, the product of printing, and of a world starting to feel the impact of secularization. Shakespeare is above all a poet, and he is still writing for people who listen and who do not know how to read. The sacred always belongs to the acoustic sphere. Cervantes, on the other hand, is a prosaic who writes for people who read, albeit it is true that his novel was also read out loud to the illiterate. However, the difference between the audience who attend a play in the Globe Theatre and the audience who reads a printed novel at home is absolute, revolutionary, and decisive. Shakespeare and Cervantes, each in their own way, dramatize a world in which the divine is fading away and where a new understanding of humankind, based solely on reason, is emerging. The way Cervantes broached this issue is supremely subtle and extremely ingenious. Throughout the novel, Don Quixote never goes to Mass, something singularly strange in such a profoundly Catholic country, except that the church is no place for the antics in which ingenious Hidalgo and his esquire are usually embroiled. If we look at the very summary description Cervantes provides for Alonso Quijano, we quickly come to understand that what we have here is in fact an age version of the Christ, the second incarnation, as Felix Delfour observed. Jesus, in Christian theology, is a God who became man for the first time to redeem humanity from death. Don Quixote is the final inhabitant of a divinized world, which no one recognizes anymore and which is being replaced by a technified world. Let us look, for example, at the famous scene with the windmills. Don Quixote sees giants, with Sancho, and along with him the average person, sees only windmills, which at the time were a relatively new invention, imported from other northern European countries. So giants are mythical creatures who belong to the realm of legends and superstition. In contrast, windmills are technical artifacts, characteristic of a new era which Don Quixote rejects and repudiates. In recounting this episode, Cervantes highlights precisely this modernity through its rejection on the part of Don Quixote. Don Quixote is a story of a man discovering the very world that he is rejecting, which leads him to experience a new form of death, irreversible and from which there is no salvation. Drunk on transcendence, Don Quixote rides through a world of disenchantment. The masterful genius of Cervantes is encapsulated in the sentence with which, at the end of the novel, he describes the death of Don Quixote. Cervantes says that Don Quixote, in his deathbed, dio su espíritu, quiero decir que se murió. Yielded up his spirit, that is to say, died. I'm quoting from the translation by John Orville. Dio su espíritu, yielded up his spirit, is a direct quote from the Bible. Jesus, evangelists tell us, cried out in a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, thereby entering eternity. By adding this simple and ironic turn of phrase, quiere decir que se murió, that is to say, died, Cervantes concentrates the entire intensity on a man who is dying, not as a son of God, but rather as a simple son of a next-door neighbor. 2 centuries later, Goya used a similar device to draw the first corpses spilling up in the streets. Shakespeare and Cervantes were founders, respectively, of modern English and modern Spanish. The dialogue between Don Quixote and Sancho implies the dramatization of 2 opposite forms of speech, one aristocratic and epic, which was already disappearing, the other popular, alive, the language of the streets. Somewhere between these 2 forms of language sits the voice of the narrator, as he pretends to be translating an Arabic story written by one Cide Hamete Benengeli. So prose is the fundamental vehicle of the world to which printing gave life. That is an enchanted world in which people no longer converse with God, but talk with mortals. A world in which people no longer listens, but begins to see new things, perhaps too many things we can see today. As the great Chilean poet Nicanor Parra noted, the first sentence of Don Quixote perfectly captures the prosodic shift of the Renaissance. En un lugar de la Mancha, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, en un lugar de la Mancha, in a village of La Mancha, is an octosyllabic line, the standard meter of Spanish medieval and popular poetry. De cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, is, in turn, an endecasyllable, the meter which Garcilaso and Boscan imported from Italy. The latter would serve for the composition of a new Spanish vocal music, more or less equivalent to the iambic pentameter in English. Ironically, whereas the Spaniards were somewhat oblivious to the revolutionary character of the prose of Cervantes, it was promptly adopted and very skillfully adapted in England, especially throughout the 18th century in the works of Lawrence Sterne and Henry Fielding. We know more about Shakespeare's life than is generally acknowledged. Of all these recent playwrights and poets, perhaps with the exception of Ben Jonson, Shakespeare is the one about whom we have the most biographical data, although little is known about what he did before arriving in London in the 1580s. As mentioned before, just like Cervantes, Shakespeare did not go to university. Thou hast, as Ben Jonson wrote in his laudatory poem printed in the first volume of 1623, was more Latin and less Greek. His relationship with playwriting probably started through acting. It was probably only little by little that he tried his hands at writing his own plays. In those formative years, the star of the London theatre scene was the young, brilliant, if somewhat shadowy Christopher Marlowe. He was an exact contemporary of Shakespeare. They were born the same year, but they came from 2 very different backgrounds. Marlowe had studied at Cambridge and belonged to a group of writers known as the University Wits. He mastered Latin and Greek. He was the great precursor of Shakespeare, and so, to that extent, is the author who elevated English theatre to universal status. Based on what can be gleaned from Shakespeare's early works, particularly Henry VI and Richard III, it is evident that Shakespeare was fascinated by Marlowe and wanted to imitate him. Recent philological studies have even posited that Henry VI was written in collaboration with Marlowe. Whatever the case, in the early stages of his career, Shakespeare was a brilliant writer of comedies, but was less successful with tragedies, and generally speaking, in achieving a more elevated tone. Works such as Titus Andronicus or even the popular Richard III still lack maturity and are strongly influenced by the Marlowean model. Richard II is in and of itself a remarkable play. but still was based on Marlowe's Edward II. Marlowe's great heritage lies in having gifted English blank verse with dramatic capacity for the first time. The metric line with 5 feet stressed on the even-numbered syllables, which 19th century scholars called iambic pentameter, was in fact first used by Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, in his partial translation of Virgil's Aeneid. Marlowe then used it to explore on a stage the issue of humankind starting to assume control over the world. Now, Shakespeare struggled with tragedy at first. However, from the beginning, he was a superb author of comedies. Early plays such as the Comedy of Errors or Two Gentlemen of Verona, influenced by Plautus, are both brilliant and authentic. A Midsummer Night Dream or Love, Labour, Lost are works of art in their own right, not to mention Not to Like It, which is, in my opinion, his best comedy ever and one of his best plays. Through comedy, Shakespeare gradually mastered his fear of and respect for Marlowe. In his historical plays, particularly in his Henriette cycle, which includes Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V, Shakespeare became skilled in a more serious and elevated style, and finally conquered tragedy, the genre which Marlowe has brought to peak maturity before dying in 1593 in the famous Brawl in Deptford. A little we know about Marlowe's life is certainly fascinating. He was homosexual, provocative, and despite working for Sir Francis Walsingham, entangled in the wars between Catholicism and Protestantism. No doubt an intriguing figure, the staff of legend. Shakespeare, on the other hand, had a far more conventional life, something which came as a disappointment to 18th century biographers, who had preferred the author of Hamlet to have had a much more romantic and exciting life. Shakespeare married a woman, 8 years older, had 3 sons, lost one of them, Hamlet, one of the twins, who died in 1596, made good money, invested in buying the biggest house in Stratford, got a coat of arms for his family, something which was mocked by Ben Jonson, and died of a typhoid fever contracted after a night of hard drinking with Ben Jonson. That at least is what John Ward, the vicar of the Holy Church in Stratford, told in his diary 50 years after Shakespeare's death. It is a beautiful story, and I personally wish it to be true. In the 2 parts of Henry IV, an extraordinary play in and of itself, Shakespeare started to try out the motifs he would explore in greater depth in his tragedies. Of course, works like Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet helped him perfect this. However, it was first and foremost in the 2 parts of Henry IV that Shakespeare started to soar as a playwright. The playing off of the tensions among Prince Hal, his father Henry IV, and the unforgettable and cunning Sir John Falstaff, we see him in fact trying out the riven consciousness that in a later play will haunt Prince Hamlet. Shakespeare took nothing for granted and managed to formulate new questions about humankind, casting off preconceived ideas. Harold Bloom's claim that Shakespeare is responsible for the invention of the human seems to me exaggerated. The idea of the human was invented in the West by the ancient Greeks, by authors such as Sophocles or Plato, and by the Hebrew people through the literature of the Bible. Rather than inventing the concept of the human, what Shakespeare did was discover a new way of being human. There is an idea which is repeated in several of his works and which summarizes what I am attempting to say. Ripeness is all, or the readiness is all. This notion finds its roots in Stoicism, which in Shakespeare's hands takes on new significance and new transcendence. One must be prepared. For what? All his works, be they tragedies or comedies, consistently follow a very similar pattern. At the beginning, there is a community which is altered by an event, whether falling in love, disobedience, treason, or an assassination. Thereafter, the affected characters have to go through a series of trials, generally in a physical location removed from civilization. For example, in the forest of Auden, or in the moor in King Lear. At the end, these characters are transformed, transfigured, and they enter a new world, either tragically to their condemnation or magically to their salvation, as is in the case of the comedies and the romances. Among other things, Shakespeare distances himself from Neoplatonist and pastoral rhetoric in expressing a new vision of love, as can be seen in As You Like It. This can also be found in his sequence of sonnets. The first part, dedicated to the fair youth, is nothing other than an attempt to update Neoplatonist motifs and Latin literature. Whereas the second part, dedicated to the dark lady, is an exploration of selfishness, obsession, lascivious, and self-destructive desire. A brave new world indeed. In his tragedies, following Marlowe's example, as we have already explained, Shakespeare succeeded like no other in exploiting the space left open by the prohibition to represent sacred themes on the stage. Thanks to this, the playwrights of his generation turned to classical tragedy, particularly to the work of Seneca, since the great Greek tragedies had not yet been very well disseminated. So when Shakespeare came to write tragedies, he based himself on the tradition of revenge tragedy, or the tragedy of blood, and converted it into something completely different and with universal scope. Shakespeare was strongly influenced by classical authors such as Ovid, Horace, Lucretius, or Cicero. He had attended the Latin grammar school in Stratford, as every boy of his age, and probably knew by heart many lines by these Roman authors, in spite of Ben Jonson's claim that he was more Latin and less Greek. Incidentally, his Latin influence is the living proof that, culturally at least, England belongs to Europe, whether or not the United Kingdom belongs to the European Union. That is not a decision, that's evidence embodied in the work of Shakespeare. Let us take the example of Hamlet, in principle a revenge tragedy, but which ends up being something else. In fact, there was an earlier Hamlet play, the so-called Ur-Hamlet, which may have been written by Shakespeare himself, or perhaps by Thomas Keats, and which is believed to have been a classical revenge tragedy. In all events, Shakespeare places his character in an unsustainable state of tension. The late Spanish writer Rafael Sánchez Ferlosio, who died a few weeks ago, in his essay on Don Quixote, which is, in my opinion, the best essay written on Don Quixote in the 20th century, in fact was his acceptance speech of the Cervantes Prize, which he received 15 years ago or so. This essay, entitled Character and Fate, borrows these two critical concepts from Walter Benjamin, the great German Jewish critic, to describe Don Quixote as a protagonist whose tragedy amounts to the fact that he's a figure of fate, with no choice but to be a figure of character. So each step of a figure of fate, the protagonist of classical epics and tragedy, leads him toward a glorious, predetermined ending, whereas a figure of character is doomed to reliving the same thing over and over again, while endlessly challenging the plot, as does Charlie Chaplin in his films. When Don Quixote is vanquished on Barcelona beach by the night of the white moon, he loses his last opportunity to be a figure of fate. Instead of granting the Hidalgo a heroically tragic death, the Knight of the White Moon, who is in fact Sansón Carrasco in disguise, decides to send the old man back to his village, where Don Quixote has to die like a common man. Hamlet, for his part, is a figure of character who refuses to be a figure of fate. In the first act, Prince Hamlet is ordered to avenge the death of his father by a ghost who is in purgatory. We need to remember that purgatory is a conceptual space specific of a certain Catholic eschatology which is not recognized in Protestantism. Having received this revelation in the supernatural order, Hamlet sets out to verify these facts in the fictional order by writing and staging a play, The Mousetrap. Hamlet thus becomes one of the many characters in Shakespeare's plays that at the same time are the authors of their own plays. All of them will be later subsumed in Prospero, the musician of The Tempest. The Mousetrap is performed in front of his uncle Claudius and his mother, and depicts the poisoning of the old King Hamlet, as you will remember. Even when he confirms through reason that his father has indeed been murdered, Hamlet delays taking action time and again, paralyzed by reason and rationality. Shakespeare's monologues, rather than serving to advance the narrative, rail against the tyranny of the plot. The soliloquies are in fact a wellspring of character. They are useless in terms of plot. Hamlet's father was a warrior king, determined and brave, who could very well have been the protagonist of his own very own epic poem or revenge tragedy. His son, however, is a student at Wittenberg, the city of Luther, born under the sign of Saturn, melancholic, overweight, and somewhat gauche, as we know from his final duel. Hamlet desperately loves the ghost of his father, but at the same time he wants to flee the fate imposed upon him, thwarting the plot of the tragedy of which he is the main character, questioning everything and desperately trying to stop the wheel of fate and the course of history, which is nothing but a succession of corpses and flies. Hamlet, like Don Quixote, is a character trapped between two eras, between the old world of superstition and religion and the new world of human reason and the solitude of mankind, between the old merry England of Catholicism and the cold new light of Protestantism. Something happens between the first and the final act of Hamlet. Something very important. In the end, there are no ghosts anymore, because everything has changed forever. The ripeness is all indeed. In the final act, Hamlet is suddenly 30 years old, whereas at the beginning of the play was only a student of about 17 years of age. Is this a mistake, as some publishers contend? I don't think so. I believe it's something completely calculated on Shakespeare's part. In the final act, Hamlet is in the winter of another age. He has freed himself from the ghost of his father, from the beliefs of the old Catholic England, which had also been the beliefs of Sir John Falstaff, and confronts a time in which death is nothing more than cold soil and rotten bones. The burial of Ophelia is in fact the funeral of youth. Ophelia follows all the wonderful feminine characters of the comedies. She is the final one, sacrificed on the altar of tragedy to seal the end of an era. When Horatio tells him that perhaps the final duel can be suspended, Hamlet says this: "Not a whit. We defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, it is not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man has aught of what he lives, what is to live betimes." There are certain monologues in Hamlet and King Lear where one can hear the influence of Montaigne, another of Shakespeare's favorite writers. He read the essays in the translation of his friend John Florio, probably years before the book was published in book form. Shakespeare, recognizing Montaigne's reflections made of classical literature, a similar way of thinking, and incorporated his tone in many of his soliloquies. It is fascinating to see how Shakespeare plays with language throughout his works, combining verse and prose, for example, and near the end of his career, particularly in King Lear, taking poetry to a radical extreme, in a process of dispossessing and divesting in a way that has never since been repeated. Shakespeare built up a house for the English language and filled it with voices. Everything in Shakespeare is a speech and nothing but a speech. A speech, moreover, which has thousands of nuances and variations, from the most elevated royal tone to the lowest and basest. In the final act of Hamlet, the new world, devoid of gods and ghosts, supposes first and foremost an acoustic revelation, because voices are now speaking another language, which is external, ripped bare. The rest is silent. In the end, Hamlet is defeated and Denmark becomes governed by Fortinbras, the warrior son of the King of Norway, a crown prince as God intended. Yet what remains is the voice of Hamlet in his monologues, the voice which speaks of what exists beyond the constraints of history, power, and plot. The Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert explained it beautifully by writing a monologue of the young Fortinbras, imagining his words before the dead body of Hamlet. Young Fortinbras is a true character of fate, speaking to the dead and defeated Prince Hamlet. I quote only the last stanzas of the poem, titled Elegy of Fortinbras. Anyhow, you had to perish, Hamlet. You were not for life. You believed in crystal notions, not in human clay. Always twitching as if asleep, you hunted chimeras. Wolfishly you crunched the air only to vomit. You knew no human thing. You did not know even how to breathe. Now you have peace, Hamlet. You accomplish what you had to, and you have peace. The rest is not silence, but belongs to me. You chose the easier path, an elegant thrust. But what is heroic death compared with eternal watching, with a cold apple in one's hands on a narrow chair, with a view of the anthill and the clock's dial? Adieu, Prince. I have tasks. A sewer project, a decree on prostitutes and beggars. I must also elaborate a better system of prisons, since, as you justly said, Denmark is a prison. I go to my affairs. This night is born. A star named Hamlet. We shall never meet. What I shall leave will not be worth of a tragedy. It is not for us to greet each other or bid farewell. We live on archipelagos and on water. These words, what can they do? What can they do, Prince? King Lear is not only Shakespeare's best play, it is one of the fundamental works of Western culture. We have still not yet recovered from what takes place in this play. The descent into madness of Lear, Kent, Edgar, Gloucester, and the Fool in the third act is the descent of humankind to its lowest, there where one can see the forces that are greater than humankind. The flowery and pompous language of the first act becomes a dry new form of poetry, which means a new form of existence. Lear goes from being a god to becoming a poor, terminally ill old man. Edgar becomes Pouton, a beggar, assuming a hallucinating and delirious way of talking which masks a deep existential metamorphosis. Meanwhile, Cordelia's silence is that of a mystical extreme, ineffable love and the still point of the turning world, to put it with the line of T.S. Eliot. The image of Lear in the last act, carrying the corpse of Cordelia, is a modern Pietà, a scenic depiction of how the modern world has stripped pain of its meaning. The Christian Pietà, Virgin Mary, cradling the dead body of Christ, announced the end of death and the coming of the kingdom of God. Whereas Lear, when he appears bellowing like an animal, howl, 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 O you are men of stones, has already turned into a poor old man now experiencing a new way of being human. It would have been impossible in the first act. The gods have disappeared, and the dead body of his daughter is the new author of meaning. Before dying, Lear utters the most accurate yet most terrible verses ever written. And my poor fool is hanged. No, no, no life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? O thou'll come no more. Never, 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 never. This never repeated 5 times is the epitaph of the impending secular era and in which we are still living today. This never weighs on us like a tombstone. It is our epitaph. Shakespeare thereby became the pivotal poet of the West. This can be compared with the extraordinary words that Sancho Panza utters to a dying Don Quixote. I must read this first in Spanish. Ay, respondió Sancho llorando, no se me muera vuestra merced, señor mío, sino tome mi consejo y viva muchos años, porque la mayor locura que puede hacer un hombre en esta vida es dejarse morir sin más ni más, sin que nadie le mate ni otras manos le acaben que las de la melancolía. Mire, no sea perezoso, sino levántese de esa cama y vámonos al campo vestidos de pastores como tenemos concertado. Quizá, tras de alguna mata hallaremos a la señora Dulcinea desencantada, que no haya más que ver. Si es que se muere de pesar de verse vencido, écheme a mí la culpa diciendo que por no haber yo cinchado mal a Rocinante le derribaron. Cuánto más que vuestra merced habrá visto en sus libros de caballerías ser otra cosa ordinaria, derribarse unos caballeros a otros, y el que es vencido hoy, ser vencedor mañana. Ah, said Sancho weeping, don't die, master, but take my advice and live many years. For the foolish thing a man can do in this life is to let himself die without rhyme or reason, without anybody killing him or any hands, but melancholy's making an end of him. Come, don't be lazy, but get up from your bed and let us take to the fields in Shepherd's Stream as we agreed. Perhaps behind some bush you shall find the Lady Dulcinea disenchanted, as fine can be. If it be that you are dying of vexation at having been vanquished, lay the blame on me, and say you were overthrown, because that girl Rocinante badly. Besides, you must have seen in your books of chivalry that it is a common thing for knights to upset one another, and for him who is conquered today to be conquered tomorrow. Yet again, a reverse mechanism is at play here. Cervantes portrays the opposite of what he wants to express. It is the irony that the Catholic Cervantes has to use to express tragedy. In the end, Sancho wants to believe in the heroic death of Don Quixote, in the heroic death that Don Quixote has searched for throughout the novel, and that he himself has done nothing but question. In doing so, he brings to light the commonness of the conditions in which his master is to die. The readiness is all indeed. It is pointless to wonder whether Shakespeare was better than Cervantes. Both elevated the literature of their time to a point of no return. There is no doubt that Shakespeare's body of work encompasses a broader spectrum of humanity, but Cervantes managed to create one of the most powerful myths of Western culture with his 2 characters. Don Quixote and Sancho have taken on a life beyond the novel, whereas Hamlet, King Lear, Prospero, cannot live but through their words, their poetry, which are not theirs but those of Shakespeare. Both authors, as I said at the beginning, continue to stimulate our modes of interpretation and help us to continue raising the basic questions about the human condition. I thank you.